In the final months of 1943, as the Pacific Air War shifted toward the Central Pacific, Japanese naval commanders began receiving scattered but unsettling reports from surviving pilots. American fighters were appearing at altitudes the Zero could barely reach, diving with crushing speed from above, climbing away with power no Japanese engine could match, and refusing to engage in the traditional turning duels where the A-6M had reigned supreme since early 1942. At first, these reports were dismissed as exaggerations, combat panic, misidentification, or simple pilot error. But after the first major encounters around Marcus Island and Wake, the pattern became impossible to ignore. The Americans had introduced a fighter unlike anything the Imperial Japanese Navy had seen before. Its name was the Grumman F-6F Hellcat. The Zero's reputation had been built on the early war myth that Japanese aviation operated on a superior aerodynamic philosophy, lightweight construction, extreme maneuverability, minimal armor, and long range. For a time, this philosophy dominated poorly coordinated Allied aircraft like the F-4F Wildcat, P-39, and early P-40 models. But by late 1943, the U.S. Navy and Grumman had rewritten the rulebook. The Hellcat's huge Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine delivered nearly twice the horsepower of the Zero's Nakajima Sakai, and more importantly, it maintained that power at altitude thanks to a far more advanced supercharging system. This was the first thing Japanese pilots noticed. The Hellcat fought with equal ferocity at 5,000 feet, 15,000 feet, or 30,000 feet. The Zero could not. Above 20,000 feet, the altitude band where most carrier defense and interception battles occurred, the A-6M began to suffocate. Its Sakai 21 engine, optimized for low weight efficiency rather than high altitude power, lost massive horsepower as air density decreased. Pilots complained that the Zero became sluggish, unable to sustain climbs or high-speed maneuvers. Meanwhile, the Hellcat still accelerated, still climbed, still rolled with authority, and still held energy like a falling hammer. Japanese after-action reports from the 582nd and 201st Air Groups noted that Hellcats descend upon us from heights previously uncontested and retain speed after climbing where our engines fail. The psychological effect was immediate. For the first time in the war, Japanese pilots no longer controlled where the fight began. Early war victories against the Wildcat had been based on choosing altitude, timing, and angle of attack. Now, the Americans dictated all three. Hellcats routinely started engagements at 25,000 to 30,000 feet, diving with overwhelming kinetic advantage. Zero pilots, struggling to climb above 20,000 feet without stalling or overheating, had no means to intercept them. Those who tried were simply swatted aside by 6.50 caliber guns whose range and striking power dwarfed the Zero's 20mm, 7.7mm armament. What shocked Japanese commanders most was how seamless the Hellcat's dominance was across multiple altitude bands. At low altitude near the fleet, where Zero pilots had once relied on tight turns to evade American fighters, the Hellcat's sheer power-to-weight ratio allowed it to fight vertically, pummeling Zeros with zoom climbs and high-angle dives that the lighter Japanese fighter could not counter. At medium altitude, where most dogfights occurred during raids on Truk, Rabaul, and the Marshalls, the Hellcat's superior roll rate at high speeds allowed American pilots to make energy-advantaged slashing attacks that minimized Zero's strengths. And at high altitude, critical for protecting carrier task forces from incoming raids, the Hellcat was simply untouchable. This transformation became undeniable after the carrier raids on the Marshall Islands in late 1943. Japanese pilots attempting to intercept American strike groups reported that the Hellcats met them higher and faster than expected. Bombers that should have been exposed during their climb-out were instead surrounded by Hellcat cover as early as 25,000 feet. When a Zero attempted to climb into that altitude band, the engine began to lose power dramatically, forcing pilots to enter the fight already struggling. The growing realization inside the Imperial Japanese Navy was grim. The altitude flexibility that the A6M0 lacked was not a minor disadvantage. It was a fatal design limitation in the new era of American carrier air power. The Hellcat was not simply better, it was better everywhere. Fleet commanders noted that this all-altitude dominance allowed American CAP, or Combat Air Patrol, to intercept Japanese raids at multiple stages, far out at 25,000 feet, during mid-altitude approaches, and even at low altitude as stragglers retreated. No matter where the Zeros tried to fight, Hellcats were waiting. When Japanese intelligence finally compiled its late 1943 assessments, one sentence stood out: the enemy fighter is superior in all regions of air combat. This was the moment the myth of the Zero's invincibility died. Japanese pilots who once boasted of unmatched agility now returned shaken, describing a fighter that could dive like a stone, climb like a rocket, and roll with terrifying force. Commanders who once believed maneuverability alone could win battles realized they were facing a machine built on a different philosophy: power, protection, altitude performance, and overwhelming firepower. The arrival of the Hellcat marked the end of Japan's early war air dominance. It was not just a new American fighter, it was a new era of air combat, one where Japan no longer dictated the terms. And as the next chapters of the Pacific War would prove, the A6M0's altitude ceiling would become one of the most decisive weaknesses the Hellcat would exploit again and again, from the Marshalls to the Marianas. From the moment the F-6F Hellcat entered combat, its greatest advantage over the A6M0 was not a single statistic. It was a pattern of superiority that the Japanese quickly discovered held true at every altitude, in every phase of the fight, no matter who initiated the engagement. This dominance was rooted in engineering choices the Americans had made after studying early war combat data. Build a fighter around raw engine power, rugged protection, and aerodynamic stability at high speed, rather than extreme lightness and slow-speed agility. To Japanese engineers, who had designed the Zero for range and maneuverability above all else, this was almost a foreign philosophy. But by 1943, it was clear which philosophy the future belonged to. At the heart of the Hellcat's performance was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a 2,000-horsepower radial engine whose power curve remained remarkably stable as altitude increased. Thanks to its two-stage supercharger, the R2800 could maintain strong manifold pressure well into the thin air above 20,000 feet. In contrast, the Zero's Nakajima Sakai 12 and later Sakai 21 engines lacked advanced high-altitude supercharging, causing them to lose horsepower rapidly the higher they climbed. Japanese pilots complained that by 22,000 feet, the Zero felt starved for air, its throttle response sluggish, and its climb rate collapsing. Meanwhile, the Hellcat, barely working at those altitudes, could still pour on power to climb, accelerate, or dive at will. This disparity shaped the entire Pacific Air War. Above 25,000 feet, Hellcats owned the sky. They met incoming Japanese raids at high altitude, where the Zeros struggled even to achieve formation. When American pilots rolled into a dive, the Hellcat's strong reinforced wings allowed them to push past 380 or even 400 miles per hour. A Zero attempting the same maneuver risked structural failure or uncontrollable flutter. Thus, the Hellcat defined the vertical battlefield. If a Japanese pilot attempted to follow it into a dive, the Zero began to shake violently. If he tried to climb to meet it, the fighter ran out of power before reaching combat position. At medium altitudes, around 10,000 to 20,000 feet, the region where many dogfights over Truk, the Marshalls, and the Philippines unfolded, the difference in structural philosophy became even more evident. The Hellcat could roll at high speed with far greater authority than the Zero. American pilots exploited this relentlessly,
using slashing attacks and high-speed yo-yo maneuvers that let them fire in bursts and then break away without ever entering the Zero's preferred turning radius. Japanese aviators reported with frustration that the Hellcat refuses to turn fight, describing how its pilots used energy retention to stay above or ahead of the Zero, never giving it the slow-speed engagement it needed. These tactics were exactly what American instructors had drilled into pilots through the Thatch Weave and later high-speed boom and zoom doctrines. The Hellcat did not just enable these tactics, it amplified them. But the shock for Japanese commanders came when reports revealed that even at low altitude, where the Zero's maneuverability was supposed to offer its greatest advantage, the Hellcat still dominated many engagements. The Zero could turn tighter at stall speeds, but in real combat, where aircraft met at 250 to 300 miles per hour, turn radius mattered far less than stability, roll rate, and the ability to retain energy through a vertical loop. At these speeds, the Hellcat's broader wing and stronger ailerons allowed it to roll inside the Zero and reposition for shots that the A6M could not counter. American pilots quickly learned that if they stayed out of slow horizontal turns, they could dictate the fight even at low level. Moreover, the Hellcat's durability gave it an enormous psychological edge. While the Zero's light construction allowed it to outcircle opponents, it could not withstand punishment. A few 50-caliber hits were often enough to destroy or cripple it. The Hellcat, however, could absorb machine gun rounds, explosive cannon shells, and flak fragments that would have ripped a Zero apart. Pilots returned with cylinders blown off, wings full of holes, and oil coolers shredded, but they still returned. This meant Hellcat pilots could press attacks more aggressively than Zero pilots, who had to fight with extreme caution to avoid even minor hits. Japanese intelligence eventually concluded that the Hellcat was strong at every altitude band, a phrase that appeared repeatedly in after-action assessments from early 1944 onward. They cataloged its specific advantages. Its climb rate was superior at medium and high altitude. Its dive capability was far beyond anything Japan fielded. Its speed exceeded the Zero by 40 to 60 miles per hour depending on altitude. Its firepower was overwhelming, and its resilience made it possible for American pilots to fight with a confidence Japanese aviators could not match. What troubled Japanese commanders most was that this superiority translated directly into tactical flexibility. The Hellcat could intercept high-altitude bombers, escort American torpedo and dive bombers, defend the fleet, perform fighter sweeps, and still fight at low altitude without suffering performance penalties. The Zero, by contrast, was forced into a narrower band of optimal conditions, low to mid-altitude, turning fights, and engagements that relied on surprise rather than brute speed or power. By 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy realized the grim reality. They were fighting an aircraft that had no obvious weakness. The Zero's design, once praised as revolutionary, now looked dangerously outdated. Its designers had gambled everything on maneuverability and range at the cost of armor, firepower, and altitude performance. In the early war, this gamble paid off, but in the face of an opponent built around power, survivability, and multi-altitude dominance, the gamble had become a strategic liability. The Hellcat did more than outperform the Zero. It redefined what a naval fighter needed to be: fast, rugged, deadly, and capable of fighting wherever the enemy tried to hide. For Japanese commanders, the realization was chilling. No matter where they sent their pilots, over the fleet, above the islands, or high in the Pacific air, they now faced an American fighter that met them on equal terms or better. And the higher the fight climbed, the worse the odds became. The first real proof that the Hellcat dominated every altitude band arrived not in grand fleet engagements, but in the probing raids of late 1943, when the U.S. Navy began testing its new fighter in limited operations against Japanese outposts. During the Marcus Island raid on September 1, 1943, Hellcats made their combat debut. Japanese pilots from the 251st Air Group scrambled to intercept what they believed were Wildcats, or early war American types. Instead, they found Hellcats climbing effortlessly past 25,000 feet, tearing through intercept attempts with high-speed diving attacks. After-action reports described engagements where the Zero pilots
could not follow the enemy into the vertical and were unable to prevent American bombers from striking the island. Although small in scale, Marcus Island was a warning. 2 months later, during operations around Wake Island, the pattern repeated itself, now in larger numbers. Task Force 58 unleashed Hellcats in fighter sweeps over the island, where Zeros attempted to intercept from mid-altitude. Hellcat pilots used the same formula repeatedly: climb above the Zero, roll into a dive, and fire short bursts of .50 caliber rounds that shredded the lightly built Japanese fighters. Pilots returning to Japanese bases described the new American aircraft as impossible to counter in the vertical, a theme that would echo through every subsequent battle. But the Hellcat's true proving ground came in 1944, beginning with the massive carrier raids against Truk Lagoon in February, codenamed Operation Hailstone. Truk, often called the Gibraltar of the Pacific, was Japan's major forward base, defended by experienced pilots flying the A6M50, the best variant available at that time. Here, altitude mattered more than ever. Japanese CAP often launched from 18,000 to 22,000 feet, climbing desperately to meet incoming waves of F-6Fs and bombers. But the Hellcats operating from higher altitude and with superior climb performance consistently reached the interception zones first. Pilots of Air Group 12 flying from USS Bunker Hill described the fight as almost one-sided. Zeros attempted to climb into position, stalled out, and were caught in descending Hellcat slashing attacks that the A6M5 could not evade at high speeds. The Americans lost only a handful of planes. The Japanese lost nearly all the aircraft they committed. The shock among Japanese commanders was enormous. If the Zero could not defend Truk, one of Japan's most important fortresses, what could it defend? The next revelation came during the Marianas Campaign, when American carrier forces moved to capture Saipan, Tinian, and Guam in June 1944. These battles forced the Imperial Japanese Navy to commit its remaining carrier aviation strength in a do-or-die attempt to halt U.S. advances. They launched hundreds of aircraft from their carriers and island bases, hoping to overwhelm Task Force 58's defenses. They expected, as they had in early 1942, to dictate the altitude and tempo of the fight. Instead, they flew straight into a wall of Hellcats operating at altitudes where the Zero could barely maintain combat performance. What followed became known to history as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a devastating demonstration of American pilot training, radar vectoring, and aircraft superiority. But often overlooked is why the slaughter was so lopsided. The Hellcats' all-altitude mastery made every Japanese tactic obsolete. The Japanese launched their strike groups at high altitude, hoping to bypass the fleet's outer defenses. But Hellcat CAP, stationed at 28,000 to 30,000 feet, dove onto them with crushing speed, breaking up formations before they came within 50 miles of the task force. Japanese pilots tried diving to low altitude to shake the interceptors, another tactic that had worked earlier in the war. It failed. Hellcats followed them down, retaining speed they had built up during the initial dive. When Zero pilots attempted to escape by pulling into steep climbs, their engines choked at altitude, allowing Hellcats to arc upward and fire into their bellies. Japanese operations logs from the 1st Carrier Air Fleet recorded shockingly high losses, as many as 346 aircraft destroyed on June 19th alone, compared to around 30 American aircraft lost. Later battles only confirmed the trend. During the Formosa air battles of October 1944, Japanese defenders attempted to challenge American raids at mid and high altitude, but Hellcats and F-4U Corsairs fought their way through with overwhelming energy advantage. Japanese aviators reported being driven downwards in every engagement, unable to contest the upper layers of the sky. Many Zero pilots died never having even reached firing range. Even late in the war, as newer Japanese fighters like the A6M8, the K-84, or the N1K2J attempted to challenge American aircraft, the A6M0 remained the backbone of Japanese naval aviation, and it simply could not survive against the P-47 of the sea. The Hellcat's performance envelope covered all altitude bands, while the Zero's was confined to the shrinking middle. Each major battle, Marcus, Wake, Truk, the Marianas, Formosa, reinforced the same story. Japan had lost the altitude war, and with it the ability to choose how or where to fight. For the Japanese High Command, these engagements were more than defeats, they were revelations. The Hellcat had turned the sky into American territory, and once the Americans owned the sky at every altitude, Japan's air war was already lost. By late 1944, after months of disastrous encounters from Truk to the Marianas and the Philippines, the Imperial Japanese Navy could no longer pretend that the A6M-0 was still the apex predator of Pacific air combat. Reports from squadron leaders, combat diaries, and technical evaluations all converged on the same stark conclusion. The Zero's design philosophy, celebrated in 1941 and 1942, had become a death sentence against the new generation of American fighters. The F-6F Hellcat dominated the sky not because it was slightly better, but because its advantages multiplied across every altitude band, while the Zero's strengths evaporated the moment the fight left its narrow performance window. Japanese commanders who had once boasted that the A6M could outfly anything in the Pacific now faced the painful truth that they no longer controlled altitude, speed, or the terms of engagement. The heart of the problem lay in the Zero's engine. The Nakajima Sake was brilliant for its purpose, lightweight, fuel-efficient, and capable of long-range cruising, but it had been engineered for a wartime environment Japan no longer occupied. In 1940 and 1941, the Zero fought largely against unescorted bombers and early war fighters that lacked sophisticated superchargers. High-altitude combat was scarce. The Zero did not need to excel above 20,000 feet because its opponents rarely operated there. But when Hellcats entered the war, everything changed. The R-2800 Double Wasp maintained power throughout its climb curve, creating a fighter whose performance barely degraded at altitude. Japanese engineers, reading after-action reports, grew alarmed. Their fighter was effectively blind at high altitude. Pilot complaints poured in. Zeros attempting to climb above 22,000 feet suffered rapid power loss, engine knocking, overheating, and dangerously shallow climb angles. Forced to fly at the edge of their performance envelope, Zero pilots entered combat already disadvantaged. One pilot described fighting a Hellcat above 25,000 feet as like trying to catch a falling star while running through water. Another report simply stated, "We cannot follow them up. Our altitude is lost before the fight begins." As these reports accumulated, Japanese naval aviation experts convened multiple evaluation committees in late 1943 and early 1944. Their findings, preserved in wartime correspondence and post-war analysis, were grim. They concluded that the Zero's basic architecture, its lightweight frame, minimal armor, and underpowered engine, could not be upgraded to match the Hellcat or the F-4U Corsair without adding so much weight that the aircraft's famous maneuverability would vanish. Attempts to install more powerful engines, such as the Kensei or the Sakai 31, proved difficult. The airframe simply could not handle the increased torque and temperature demands. Even prototypes like the A6M-8 failed to resolve the Zero's altitude performance issues. In strategy meetings throughout 1944, Japanese commanders confronted a dilemma without a solution. They could push their pilots to fight lower, where the Zero still had a turning advantage, but this meant surrendering the upper sky, and surrendering the upper sky meant surrendering the initiative. And at low altitude, Hellcats still held decisive advantages in speed, roll rate, and firepower. The Zero's turn rate only mattered if the American pilot chose to remain in a horizontal fight. The best U.S. aviators never did. The Imperial Japanese Navy also struggled with pilot quality. By 1944, the elite aviators who once made the Zero so feared had been killed or exhausted by relentless combat. Their replacements, trained under compressed wartime programs, lacked the experience to exploit even the A6M's remaining strengths. In contrast, American pilots underwent rigorous stateside training, gunnery schools, carrier qualification, and tactical instruction on how to defeat the Zero.
A Hellcat flown by a well-trained pilot was lethal. Flown by an expert, it was untouchable. The situation worsened when Japanese intelligence officers analyzed gun camera footage and pilot debriefings from the Battle of the Philippine Sea. What they found defied pre-war doctrine. The Zero was supposed to outmaneuver heavier American fighters. Yet footage showed Zeros failing to turn quickly at high speed, failing to climb, and failing to retain energy during merges. At higher altitudes, the aircraft appeared sluggish, barely able to reposition. Hellcats, on the other hand, used the vertical axis, something Japanese doctrine had never emphasized, to dominate every fight. By autumn 1944, Japanese commanders recognized that their fighter force had become strategically obsolete. This was not merely a question of numbers. Though U.S. carrier production dwarfed Japan's, it was a matter of performance mismatch. The Hellcat's ability to operate from sea level to 30,000 feet meant Japan no longer had a safe altitude band in which to engage. Even worse, the Zero's greatest advantage, its slow-speed agility, was practically irrelevant in modern combat, where engagements occurred at high closing speeds and where energy maneuvering, not tight turning, determined victory. Desperation led to desperate measures. Japan deployed new aircraft, such as the N1K2J Shiden-Kai and Ki-84 Hayate, which could challenge the Hellcat under certain conditions. But these aircraft arrived too late and in too small numbers, and they did not change the reality that the A6M-0 remained the most widely deployed Japanese fighter. With American offensives accelerating across the Pacific, Japanese carrier aviation collapsed, leaving land-based Zeros to face Hellcats that now escorted long-range strikes deep into Japanese territory. In the end, the Zero's fate was sealed by the very qualities that once made it great. Its lightweight construction, once a triumph of engineering, became a liability in a war that survivability mattered. Its engine, efficient but underpowered, could not compete with American supercharged radials. Its doctrine, focused on turning duels, had been outgrown by a new era of three-dimensional air combat. Japanese commanders understood all of this by the end of 1944, but there was nothing they could do. The Hellcat did not merely perform the Zero at certain altitudes, it removed altitude as a factor entirely. Wherever the Zeros flew, Hellcats were above them, faster than them, stronger than them, and ready to strike with a decisiveness the Japanese could no longer match. What had begun as tactical inferiority became strategic hopelessness, and in that hopelessness lay the final realization of the Pacific Air War. The Zero was an aircraft built for 1941. The Hellcat was a fighter built for 1944, and for every year of aerial combat to come. By the final phase of the Pacific War in 1945, the transformation was undeniable. The A6M-0, once the terror of the skies over China, Malaya, and the early Pacific, had become a relic of a vanished age, outclassed in every measurable category by the F-6F Hellcat. What made this transformation extraordinary was not just the technical superiority of the Hellcat itself, but the broader implications of what it represented. The Hellcat marked the arrival of a new doctrine of naval air warfare, one based on altitude control, engine power, and survivability. And its mastery over the Zero symbolized the moment Japan irrevocably lost the air initiative across the Pacific. In 1941, the Zero had epitomized the design philosophy rooted in long-range patrol warfare, anti-bomber defense, and the need to project power across the vast distances of the Pacific Basin. Its ability to operate from primitive airstrips, its unbelievable range, and its extremely light control response made it perfect for Japan's early offensives. At that stage, it was the right aircraft for the right war. But the war changed, and the Zero could not change with it. Once American industry reached full wartime production, the strategic picture shifted. The U.S. Navy no longer fought defensive battles from hastily prepared carriers. Instead, it fielded fast carrier task forces able to stay at sea for months at a time, launching wave after wave of coordinated airstrikes. In this environment, the qualities that mattered most were altitude performance, diving speed, climb rate, ruggedness under fire, and the ability to deliver powerful gunnery at high closure rates. These qualities defined the Hellcat and exposed every weakness in the Zero. The Americans had learned the hard way in 1942, at Coral Sea, Midway, and the Solomons, that second-place performance in the air was a death sentence. So they designed the Hellcat to be first place in every category that mattered. Its R-2800 engine gave it unmatched energy maneuverability. Its thick wing and strong frame allowed it to dive faster than any Japanese fighter without risking structural breakup. Its self-sealing tanks and pilot armor provided survivability that Zero pilots could only dream of. And its 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns offered overwhelming, decisive firepower that could shred a Zero in seconds. The result was not merely tactical domination, it was total air supremacy. For Japan, this was catastrophic. A nation that depended on carrier aviation to project power now faced an American fighter that erased that capability wholesale. During the Philippine Sea battles, for example, Hellcats operating at multiple altitude layers intercepted nearly every Japanese strike group long before they reached their targets. Zeros trying to escort their bombers were unable to climb to interception altitude in time. Those that did were overwhelmed by Hellcats diving from above. Japan's carrier offensive capability died not because its carriers were sunk, but because its fighters could no longer fight. This air supremacy had direct strategic consequences. With Hellcats sweeping the skies clean of defenders, American dive bombers and torpedo bombers could attack Japanese fleets without fear. The destruction of Admiral Ozawa's carrier air arm in June 1944 was the moment historians later called the death of Japanese naval aviation. Ozawa still had carriers, he still had flight decks, but he no longer had viable fighter cover, and without that, a carrier is nothing more than a floating coffin. For the Japanese Army Air Force, the story was no better. As Hellcats accompanied long-range raids deeper and deeper into Japanese territory, Army fighter units flying K-43 Oscars and K-44 Tojos found themselves outmatched just as severely as Navy units had been. Even newer fighters like the N-1K-2J Shidenkai could not be produced in large enough numbers to make a difference, and they never saw the systemic altitude disadvantage Japan faced. When Hellcats escorted B-29s over the home islands late in the war, the Japanese could no longer stop them, not at low altitude, not at medium altitude, and certainly not at high altitude. The collapse of Japanese air strength had ripple effects across the Pacific battlefield. Without air cover, Japanese convoys were annihilated by U.S. carrier raids and submarine attacks. Without fighter protection, Japanese ground forces from Burma to Luzon were pounded by P-47s, F-6Fs, and F-4Us. Without the ability to contest the sky, Japan's remaining ships, battleships, cruisers, even super battleships like Yamato, were deathly vulnerable to coordinated American airstrikes. The tide of war turned not simply because American industry produced more planes, but because it produced the right plane, and it trained pilots who knew exactly how to use it. By 1945, the Hellcat had achieved an unprecedented kill ratio of 19-1 against Japanese aircraft, one of the highest in aviation history. This figure was not merely a statistic, it was a reflection of the complete collapse of Japanese air combat doctrine against an opponent that understood both technology and tactics on a deeper level. The Hellcat won high, it won low, it won fast, it won slow, it won on sea, it won on land, it won in defense, and it won in offense. And throughout this transformation, the Zero never changed. It remained the lightweight, lightly armored dogfighter it had been in 1941, fighting a war that no longer existed. Japan could not redesign its doctrine, could not redesign its factories, and could not redesign the fundamentals of an airframe built around outdated assumptions. The Hellcat, by contrast, embodied the future. It was the first truly modern naval fighter, fast, rugged, flexible, armed to the teeth, and capable of dominating every corner of the sky. When Japanese commanders looked back after the war, many admitted that the Hellcat, more than any ship, any bomb, or any tank, had sealed Japan's fate in the Pacific. It was not simply an aircraft. It was the end of their air superiority, the end of their strategic initiative, and the beginning of an American-dominated sky. Once the Hellcat arrived, the Zero's era was over, and with it, the era of Japanese air dominance vanished forever.